All right, Emily, are you ready to get started?
Yeah, I'm ready.
All right, very good. Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us on this webinar. As you maybe probably a lot of you know, my name is Erin Anderson. I'm the Director of Charter School Authorizing for the Osprey Wilds Environmental Learning Center, formerly the Audubon Center of the Northwoods, which is probably a lot of your school's charter school authorizer. But if you are from a school that's not in our portfolio, welcome. We're excited to have you here. We want to talk a little bit today about ways that you can incorporate environmental education into your distance learning, and in particular, talking about how nature journaling can be a tool for that. So we're really excited that we were able to partner, the Charter School Division was able to partner with the Education Division to bring you this webinar. And I want to introduce Emily Porter, who's our Director of Education up at Osprey Wilds. Take it away, Emily.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Erin, that was awesome. I was just peeking through the participant list. You probably saw me doing that, seeing a lot of familiar folks on the participant list. So hello to all of you. If you don't know me, my name is Emily Porter. I'm the Director of Education up at Osprey Wilds Environmental Learning Center. I'm a licensed classroom teacher, and in my previous life, I worked in public schools for about a decade, teaching mostly high school English before I transitioned into outdoor education. And so I feel like I have a pretty good sense of kind of the transition between EE and classroom teaching. And when the Charter School Division asked me to do this webinar, I was like, oh, nature journaling is a perfect thing for folks to be doing with their students while they're distance learning. It doesn't require a lot of resources. It's fairly open-ended, and it can give kids a lot of ways to interact with the outdoors and with their environment. I have been nature journaling for 2 years. I learned at a Beatles conference out in Berkeley, and I was taught by a woman, Emily Ligren, who I'm also going to mention her book as well at the end here. But most of the pictures that you see are going to be my pages, unless they're otherwise noted, just so that you're aware of that. But we'll just go ahead and get started. Our agenda today, we're going to kind of break this into 3 parts. So we're going to talk about what is a nature journal. And then we're going to talk about effective ways to teach students how to journal and to journal effectively. And then we're also going to talk about some application and lesson planning ideas. At the end, I'm going to provide you with some ideas that I have for distance learning applications. And then if we have time, we might have some time for you guys to pitch in some ideas as well. There is a place for you to submit questions to the Q&A, and you can also go into the chat and post things there. I will be asking you guys some questions, so if you want to answer those in the chat, that's the best place to do that. But those questions are really just to get you thinking and get you to kind of think through what we're doing and how we teach these things effectively. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is what is a nature journal. So I have an image, I have an image here of a nature journal page. And we're going to do some investigation of this nature journal. I want you to just take a couple of seconds and just notice what key features do you notice in this page. And if you can, just drop those things into the chat. I'm going to see if I can figure out how to see the chat. There we go.
Emily, do you want, so we're recording this for people who weren't able to make it. Do you want me, or do you maybe want to read off some of the things that people are calling out in the Zoom chat as they're coming in?
Sure, Erin, that would be great if you could do that, because it's hard for me to look at the chat and also show the images.
Absolutely. So some of the things we're seeing are leaves. There's actual nature in there, although you may have to provide some clarity if those are your drawings or if those are actual leaves. Drawings with explanations, notes, labels, and pictures, headings, specimens from the environment. There's an I notice, I wonder page. Realia, ooh, that's a good
Fancy.
word. Diagram-like notes, pictures, comparisons among similar species, observations, arrows. I see there's lots of labeling.
Mhm.
There's a date at the top. There's lots of color. The page is individualized. It's not a template that you have to follow.
Mhm.
Um, Details about the leaves, their shape, their color identification. It's not typical journaling in terms of as far as appearance.
Yeah, those are all like great. You guys are hitting it right on the nose. This is my page. Those are not actual leaves, those are drawings. And you are definitely seeing the major key points. There's dates, there's information, there are labels, there's observations, and using and interacting with real objects, which is really what we're going to be focusing on with nature journaling. So to kind of get into my definition of a nature journal, often when you talk about nature journaling, people have lots of different ideas about what that means. But for me, a nature journal's purpose is to record information about the natural world for later use. And that later use can be anything. It can be an art project. It can be a piece of creative writing or personal writing. It can be a scientific study. It can be a field guide. It can really go to anything. But the goal is to record this information because you're not going to have it later. Because you're observing something real that is going to pass, or you're not going to be able to have access to it at a later date. So the primary features of a good entry is going to have things that you guys already noticed: the date, the location, the weather condition. That really makes your entry a piece of science. It gives us a place to tie your observations to and allows us to place your observations in a larger context. It's going to have detailed written observations as well as a visual representation. The visual representation is usually where kids can kind of get hung up on because they think that they're not good at drawing or that their drawings aren't very good, and we'll talk about that. But it should have both of those pieces. It's written and it's visual. It also has a purpose. A journal page should be purposeful. It should be looking at a particular question or object, and it should have a goal in what it's trying to achieve. And it should also include questions and things that the journaler is wondering about in addition to observations. So here's another example of a page. And so you'll notice it's got the date, location, and weather at the top. This journal entry was made at St. Croix State Park. September 15th. It was humid and hot that day, and it was at the junction of the Kettle and the St. Croix River. It's got written observations, it's got a visual representation, and it also has a purpose. You may not be able to notice from the journal itself, but the purpose of this was a fungus that I didn't know what it was, and I wanted to have a record of it so that I could go back and try to identify it later. So if you're looking at the journal entry, you're kind of noting, I'm noting like what it's growing on and how it looks and the way that it's growing and variations among the species, like the different shapes and things, its size, its texture. All of those details are necessary in order to make an identification. And I've also got some questions in there as well. So when you're thinking about what the journal entry like needs to look like or needs to include, you really need to think about what is the purpose of that particular entry. The other important thing to remember is that this isn't Instagram. Nature journals can look lots of different ways, and pretty drawings are not the purpose of a journal. The purpose of the journal is to record information. So on the right, this is a different journal entry that I had done of a red-tailed hawk that I saw in my neighborhood in Minneapolis, and I wanted to just quickly record like where it was and where it had gone. And so I just wrote down my observations, I drew a quick little map, and that was it. And it's not particularly pretty, but it's still a nature journal. And it's really important to show kids these kinds of examples so that they don't feel super intimidated about the ways that their journals look, as long as they're recording good information. So when we're thinking about how to teach students to use a journal, I really think about it in 4 steps. Really the most important part is to work on developing a curiosity mindset in kids. If kids aren't already curious about the natural world, if they don't already know how to like ask good questions, or if they don't know that it's safe for them to be asking questions or to not know things, then their journal entries are going to be pretty flat. So we want to start by developing a curiosity mindset. You want to be sure that you're showing models. There are lots of great images and examples of nature journals out there, and I'll give you some resources to find those at the end. But you want to be showing examples of what a nature journal would look like. Then you engage in what I call purposeful practice. So it's, you know that the point is just for them to practice, but the assignment has a very deliberate purpose, and that purpose will drive the quality of the work. And then once you have done those 3 steps, then you do an application. You can do repeated applications, but you want to make sure that you're incorporating student autonomy in those activities. And we'll talk about that when we get to the end about like what kinds of applications might work in a distance learning setting.
Emily, can I ask a question that just came in from the chat? I guess that's a clarification. Do you want questions as we go, or should I just save them all up for the end? Okay.
I had kind of planned to stop at each section, and I was actually just about to ask you if people had questions, so good timing.
Well, we have one in the chat. It says, when journaling with students, does the teacher typically provide the purpose for any given entry?
It really depends on what your goal is. I would say at the beginning, yes. The more, I like to think of them as bumpers, but like I'm thinking about bowling, you know, you have bumpers in the gutters. The more bumpers you have, the more successful they're going to be at first. And then as they get more practice under the belt, then they can decide their own purposes. Older students, you know your students better than I do. Older students might be able to create their own purpose, but I would say for the early practice, you definitely want to assign to them, like, this is what you're doing this for, and have a clear purpose in mind. It's a great question.
So Emily, there's also a question, a couple questions related to, do you bring colored pencils with you when you go outside, or do you remember those colors? And just trying to figure out what kind of equipment you bring with you and what students should bring with them.
Sure. So personally, I do have a kit of colored pencils and drawing pencils that I do carry with me. They just fit into a little pencil box. It's not that many, actually. I think it's 12. But when I work with students, I don't use colors. I just use plain pencil, and we just sketch in pencil because color is intimidating. When I started journaling, I didn't use color at all. I just started with pencil drawings and sketches. And so if you're just getting started with kids, I think it's much easier for them to approach it if you're just using pencils or maybe ink, just because the color aspect adds a whole other like range of drawing skills. It could be something that you build up to, or it could be something that you leave optional for students. Like if they're really into it, then yes, they can add color. But when I'm in the field, I don't bring colors with students. I only use pencil. Awesome questions, guys. I'm going to keep going, but we'll talk about a curiosity mindset. I'm going to have some more questions for you. But when we practice curiosity, I always use these 3 questions as prompts with my students. These come from the Beatles Project out of UC Berkeley. This is their mode of like framing investigations for students. So it's 3 very simple questions that have a lot of broad applications. And so the first question is, what do you notice? When I frame this with students, I make sure to be clear that something that you notice has to be something you can observe in the moment. It's not an opinion. It's not a guess as to what might have happened to the object. It is not an identification, because an identification is something that you already know. It has to be something that you are physically seeing while you are looking at the object. So if like a leaf has holes in it, we wouldn't say this leaf was eaten by bugs, because we haven't actually seen that happen. We do know that the leaf has small holes in it. And we might ask when we get to, what do you wonder? I wonder what made the holes in the leaf. And it's really important to make that distinction, because when we're recording scientific information, kids need to know, like, what is the difference between a scientific observation and a personal or an artistic observation. Artistic observations are awesome, and that's part of what we get to when we talk about what does it remind you of, but it's not part of what they're noticing. Noticing is observations they're making in the moment. So once they do their noticing, then we ask, what do you wonder about the object? And we encourage students to ask questions about the object. They can be anything. All questions are good questions. And especially as an educator, kids' questions often lead you down really interesting paths. And so giving them time to really ask good questions and to collate those questions and remember what they are. And then the last piece is, what does it remind you of? And when I'm talking with kids in a science context, I talk about how scientists will often be able to draw conclusions by comparing what they're seeing to things that they've seen before, right? So what does it remind you of? Well, this black spotting on this leaf kind of reminds me of the black spotting on a banana. That might lead you to a useful conclusion about what that black coloration is or is similar to. So that's one way to think about that question. But this is also an opportunity to connect what kids are looking at to their own experiences and their lived experience. And their cultural context and their background knowledge. And so it also might be, this leaf reminds me of when I used to jump in piles of leaves in my backyard. And then later I would find a leaf in my shirt and it would be all gross and wet and like blah, blah, blah. You know, so that can be a really broad category. And I always like to include it not only because of that scientific piece, but also to bring in the opportunity for kids to make connections to their lived experience and their own background knowledge. And that also builds room for kids to make poetic or artistic observations, which are also totally valid and we want to include in our journal pages. So what I'm going to have you guys do is you're going to practice. So I have an image of a Minnesota organism that is going to come on the screen. And in the chat, I want you to start with, what do you notice about this image? And Erin, if you wouldn't mind reading some of those noticings out, and then we'll move on to what do you wonder, and then we'll ask, what does it remind you of? But first, what do you notice about this organism?
The color.
Mm-hmm.
That's the only one we've gotten so far. There we go. It's teardrop shaped. That's a good one.
Nice.
It looks like new life. It has a unique shape.
Mm-hmm.
It's mottled. Oh, that's a good one. Curved, spotted, looks smooth.
We'll just take a couple more.
Its shape, it looks like a new sprout.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, now they're coming very fast. I noticed that it's coming up in the spring because of the dead thing about it. There's dead leaves around it.
Nice. Yeah.
It, mostly red with yellowish spots, seems to have 2 leaves and an inside part. It seems folded. It's in a pile of moss. It's on the ground. It's pushing up through. It folds in on itself. It looks empty, question mark, like an egg.
Great. Those are all awesome observations. If you were doing a nature journal, you might also draw this object. Having to draw an object will focus your eye on things that you might not notice when you're first looking at it and first making written observations, which is why I always encourage students to draw things with fidelity. Fidelity means, like, if somebody else looked at this, they would be able to identify the object that you were looking at, because it really helps you focus in on those observations. So then my next question is, what do you wonder about this organism?
What is it? What's inside? What does it become? Will it continue to open? What type of a bloom is it? Oh, that's a good one. Does it have a smell? Is it a plant or animal? Is it a flower? What age? Does it hold something? Is the green part on the left part of it?
Nice.
Are there more starting next to it? Was it planted? Do small animals eat it? Oh, that's a great one.
Great.
Is this the usual time for emergence? What region does it grow in?
Nice. So these are all great questions. Some of these are what I would call narrow questions. A narrow question is something that has like a discrete answer where either the instructor could tell you or you could look it up and just like, all right, there's the answer. Some of these are broader questions, right? About its place in the ecosystem or things that you might have to investigate or do a lot more research in order to figure out, or might have lots of multiple correct answers. And hopefully you're seeing that having students generate questions about an organism can lead you down some really interesting paths in talking about the environment. And then I'm not going to answer any of those questions right now. And typically when I work with students, I don't generally answer their questions right away. I make them kind of work with them and think about them for a while, which is hard for me as a teacher because I always like to give information. But the last question that we use is, what does this remind you of?
A flower, hosta sprouts, a flower bulb, alien eggs, a pitcher plant, Jack in the pulpit. Oh, camping. Oh, that's a great one.
Nice.
Let's see, we got another Jack in the pulpit. Corpse flower in the greenhouse I used to work at. New
Nice.
life and a fresh start. Spring.
Great. So you can see we're getting a really wide variety of answers to that question. Some people are going to an emotional place or a memory place. Some people are going to a identification place. A lot of the clues about what this reminds people of will help us make an identification and figure out what this organism is. But it can also open up space to talk about, oh, did you see one of these camping? Like, tell me about that. Tell me more about that. And to learn more about your students and give them an opportunity to share their lived experience with you in a really organic way. And so that's I Notice, I Wonder, It Reminds Me Of. It's a really basic protocol. You could have every prompt for every nature journal that you ever do be, I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of. It is infinitely useful and can be used in pretty much any situation. I've even used it on like poetry and like things that are not observing realia, just because it's so widely applicable. If you don't know what this is a skunk cabbage flower that I took a picture of this in Banning State Park just a couple of weeks ago. So, but that's just kind of to get you into the mindset of like, this is how you help students build up their curiosity mindset and to get them asking good questions and making good connections and making strong observations. If you do an activity like this with kids, you might notice things that they have gaps in their background knowledge that you might want to take time to address. Things that I've noticed with students that I've worked with when I do an activity like this with them is that, you know, you might want to go back and review describing words or what an adjective is. You might want to review the difference between fact and opinion. You might want to talk more about pattern recognition, or you might want to encourage them to look at broad and narrow questions, which was what I brought up when you guys brought up your questions. And with older students, you might even go over like, how do we make a hypothesis? How do we go through the scientific method? These are all things that you can think about in terms of front loading for your students before you really get into significant journaling. You might need to take a step back and be like, oh, okay, we're having a hard time describing our object. Let's just brainstorm some adjectives. What are describing words, right? And then build up those skills for them so that they can be successful. So, I'm going to take a pause here. Do we have any questions?
Yes, these are from a little bit ago, but
Okay.
Are there historical models of nature journals that are available, for example, Darwin's?
I am sure there are public archives, but I also know that the Beatles Project has it's a PDF about how to teach nature journaling, and they have models, they have images of them, and like one of them actually is Darwin's journal, where he has drawn out like the evolutionary tree in a sketch in one of his journals. So those things are available. I do know that Beatles Project has a collection of images of nature journals through time and across cultures and in different languages. And I have that posted at the end when we talk about resources, but yes, those things, you can find them. You can also find a bunch of contemporary nature journalers on Instagram. Like, I know I made fun of Instagram a little bit earlier, but there are a lot of people on Instagram who do nature journaling. You just have to search the hashtag and it'll come up.
Another question that we got was, do you recommend scholars bring a camera or phone to take pictures so they can add color after, or to create more interest, perhaps?
Yeah, I always take pictures of everything that I look at. A lot of my drawings are finished off of a picture. And if students are super intimidated, they can also include the picture in their journal entry. Like, there's no reason why they can't do that. And so, yes, this is a great way for kids to use their cell phones in a productive fashion in class. And so, yeah, I would encourage that.
Then we have a comment also that says there are many journal entries from the Lewis and Clark expedition as well, which is a great point. That there's a lot of. How do you increase motivation to take the time to journal when a picture is so fast?
Oh, sure. So really, kids need a why. They need a why do I have to draw this if I could just take a picture of it? And I always come back to the explanation of drawing. It really helps you notice the details that you might not have otherwise noticed. But I'm going to be 100% honest. I've never actually personally had a problem with a kid not wanting to draw. And now I'm trying to think if that ever happened. I mean, most kids are perfectly happy to doodle. Their doodles might not be very good, but they're happy to kind of poke around with it. But giving them the why really helps, that the purpose of doing the drawing is to focus your eye on certain details and to give a representation. And really, a lot of the barrier for students drawing is more of the fear of failing at it, of not being good at drawing. And there are lots of ways to kind of ease that for students, including like allowing them to trace. Like when I did my leaf drawings, I straight up traced those, and that's totally fine. There's no reason why you can't do that. And to really develop a growth mindset amongst your students of like, this is a skill that we're practicing, and the more that you practice it, the better you will get at it. It's not an inborn talent that people just happen to have. It's something that is born out of hard work and repeated practice. So I hope that answered the question. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as well as we get further into like applications and things as well.
Very good. I think we've got them all for now.
Great. So then you look at, so once you do your curiosity activities, then you want to look at some model texts. And we've already kind of brought up like what kinds of model texts are available, what is out there. And the benefit of looking at model text for students is that they really can see different examples of what things can look like. And that sometimes when you say like nature journal, somebody will have a preconceived notion or even a misconception about what that has to be or what it has to look like. And those limitations can be very difficult for students to overcome in terms of producing their own work. And it can cause a lot of frustration and like, oh, well, this doesn't look like it's supposed to. But if you have lots of different examples, then kids can draw from those different examples and say, you know what, it's okay that I have more words than pictures, because so did Charles Darwin. Actually, Charles Darwin did not draw a ton of pictures. He mostly wrote. And so when we look at models, you really want students to focus in on like, what is the same across these examples, and also what is different across these examples. So this is a journal from Heather Murphy. This is from the Beatles Project. They have an activity called Field Journaling with Students. This is where I source most of my examples because they have very high quality pictures and they have a diverse array of journalers. But I really like this image because, you know, it's not the most beautiful drawing in the world, but it's very evocative of what it is representing. And it has a lot of really detailed notes, but it's not necessarily about making a very pretty picture. You can also do comparisons. So these are 3 different types of pages with different kinds of layouts. So on the left, we have John Muir Laws, who's a very prominent nature journaling instructor, doing a comparison layout where he has two plants next to each other. He is very art heavy and not very word heavy, right? You have our center page by Craig Childs, who is very word heavy, but much less art heavy. Lots of good questions and observations and written work there. And then this is another one of my pages here on the left, which I think is kind of more of a blend between like an artistic representation as well as written pieces, but looking at different layouts, different ways that you can approach similar topics, using arrows, not using arrows, the ways that you label things. All of those different examples can really help students explore and feel more comfortable in their own way of engaging with what they're observing. So when we think about what you notice about the model text, it's really important to ask students this question. And they're gonna notice different things. And really the key for me is for students to walk away with the knowledge that nature journals can look like lots of different things. And as long as you're fulfilling the purpose of your journal entry, that there is a lot of leeway in what that journal entry looks like. Are there questions about that before I move on?
Do you have any models of children's journals?
I do not, but I do have a book that I'm going to recommend to you. It's a free PDF download called How to Teach Nature Journaling, and it has a bunch of images of student work in it that you can download and just post or show to students yourself. It's a free PDF, so it's easily accessible. Great question. Anything else? Cool. So then we start thinking about practice. So how do we get students to practice these skills? And again, coming back to that idea of purpose, having a clear purpose for students will improve their product. If they don't know why they're doing something, they're not going to do a very good job at it. I think that's true of pretty much any assignment that we give them. And I really like to do an activity where students are making a journal entry for the purposes of identification, because this really focuses the way that they are thinking about their object. And so each student creates a page about a natural object with the goal that other students have to be able to identify that specific object out of a group of similar objects. And if that sounds confusing, I'm going to explain. So if I were in the field, and I do this in the field with students, I pick up a leaf and I tell students to find a leaf that is the same shape of that as the leaf that I'm holding. So if it's an oak leaf, they have to find like something that looks like an oak leaf. Or if it's a maple leaf, they have to find something that is the same shape as a maple leaf. And they usually all come up with the same type of leaf that I have. So that all of these objects are fairly similar looking, but they are all individual and they have their own individual characteristics. I have them create a journal entry for their leaf for the purpose that so that their classmates can tell which leaf is yours. And when they're finished, they just put the leaf in the center with other leaves, and then they put their journal entry on the ground. And then another student has to figure out which leaf goes with the journal entry. And so having that purpose really demands a level of detail from students, and it really does push them to make pretty excellent drawings. And even if they can't make an excellent drawing, then they add a bunch of written information that really clarifies what they're looking at. And understanding that this might be really difficult to do in a distance learning, I also spent some time in my house thinking about how would I do this in a distance learning situation. And really, I think that students can easily use household or backyard items to complete this activity. Really, the only limitation is that the items have to be organic because they have to have some sort of natural variation. And they can share their pages digitally by posting photos, and they can also post photos of the objects that they're looking at. There are two ways I think to do this. You can either supply them the photo of the objects, or they can find objects in their own home and supply their own photo and drawing. Some examples of things that I found are like some garlic cloves. Like I broke up a head of garlic and I laid the cloves out. They are fairly similar in shape and color, but they have variation in size and texture and various other little quirks about them. A more advanced one would be the clementines that I have on the right. These are more uniform, but they still have their own variation in individuality. And then the one I ultimately went with was my dog's chew bones, because I thought it was kind of quirky and it was really funny to take this picture with my dog around. She kept trying to take the bones from me. But as you can see, these are all very similar in shape and size, but they have individual variation amongst the specific objects. So once you have the collection of objects, then each student chooses one and they have to produce a drawing of it. And the drawing has to, and the entry has to be good enough so that people looking at it could identify which of the objects you were actually trying to represent. Can anybody tell which letter is the one that I drew?
The prevailing consensus is F.
Yes, that's the one. So you can see how it becomes kind of a game. It's a way of sort of gamifying the activity. You can have kids, again, submit their, like, these are the collection of objects that I picked one, here's my drawing, try to figure out which one I did. Or again, you could supply the image on the left and then they could pick which one they wanted to do and submit their own drawing of it. And it is a very useful way to get kids to notice specific details, because you can't just draw a generic shape. It has to be the one that you are looking at. So I'm going to take a pause because this is a whole activity. Do you have any questions about that activity?
We gotta, this is great, and I love all the ideas. And I want to share in particular, Emily, that I think a really great thing is that notion that the teacher can provide the picture, because I know the people on this webinar probably come from all different contexts, and kids may not have access to a safe outdoor space or a backyard. And so the idea that the teacher can provide a set of things that can happen indoors but still be nature journaling, I think is really great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
oh, go ahead, sorry.
I was trying to think really hard because I live in Minneapolis. I have a backyard, and it's, you know, a fairly nice city backyard, but I don't have what most people would call like pristine nature accessible to me at my house. Like, I have a nice backyard and I enjoy it, but I was really trying to focus on what could I do with the things that I have easily at hand. And I think that that can be something that's really intimidating when we think about EE. But I really want to encourage you to reframe your thinking that, like, nature is everywhere, and there are lots of really cool things that we can do with stuff that we have in our homes and in our yards and in our neighborhoods. So go ahead, Erin, you had a question?
How much time do you allow for drawing, or to do the drawing?
It's a great question. It really, really depends on, again, your purpose. But when I'm first introducing drawing, I don't want kids to get really hung up on what they're doing. So I actually give them a pretty limited time. When I do the leaf activity the first time, I think I give them 7 minutes. Like, it's not longer than 10 and it's not less than 5. Obviously, when you're in person with kids, it's a lot easier to like adjust the time amount. You can kind of walk around and see, oh, kids need a little bit more time, they need a little bit less time. But when you're in the field, nature journaling, you know, you don't typically sit and draw for an hour, right? You're doing a pretty quick representation, and you don't want kids to get super hung up on like making the drawing perfect. And so I think that giving a relatively short amount of time is much more useful than giving kids as much time as they want. And giving them that time limitation can also help them let go of their need to have a really excellent looking thing and really focus on actually making good observations and getting all the information in. It's a great question. Other questions?
I think that's it for now.
So now what? So we're thinking about, what is a nature journal? How do we teach the actual skill of journaling? But now, how do we apply it? And as a teacher, when you're applying this skill, you really want to think about what are you trying to get students to get out of it? Like, what is your long-term goal? And nature journaling has a lot of really good uses. I think the most important one for me is just mental health and wellness, like getting kids to be mindful for 10 minutes by looking at an object and creating a tangible thing that they can show and be proud of is really, really helpful for kids' mental health. And if they can get outside to a backyard, spending 10 minutes outside in the backyard in the sunshine is so useful for them, even if what they produce has no other long-term impact on their education. Because that mental health piece is so, so key. But nature journals for scientists, field journals, are used to collect all sorts of things. You can use it to collect longitudinal data. We'll talk about an example of a application that I have about that later. You can look at experimental design. So if you have kids look at an organism and they have questions about it, can they design an experiment around that question that incorporates observation? You can practice cross-disciplinary skills. Nature journaling bleeds over into, ELA, into art, into social studies. There are all sorts of different ways that you can use the journal to explore other disciplines and do cross-disciplinary study. You can also use it to inspire independent study. And I'm sure there are a lot of other applications that I am not thinking of and that you are already thinking of because you're all excellent teachers. But we're going to kind of go over a couple of ideas as to how to really apply nature journaling in a distance learning situation. So when you're designing a unit or a lesson, you want to make sure that your long-term goal, your purpose, is very clear to you and is very clear to your students. Like, is this something that you just want kids to do, like as a way of being calm and being mindful and having something beautiful and enjoyable in their lives, and it's just like a daily prompt that you do every day and you don't grade it very harshly or whatever? Or are you doing like a longitudinal study of a Minnesota organism and it's really important that kids get accurate data, right? That's going to change the way that you frame the activity for students. You want to make sure that you're really building in student autonomy, which is necessary even when we're not distance learning, but it's especially necessary when we are distance learning because students are in such different situations. You need to make sure that when you're designing your lesson, that student choice is really in at the bedrock, because that's going to make it easier for you to accommodate kids who are in different places, who are in different situations, who have different access to nature. When we're in the field, student autonomy looks like, you can pick your own leaf, or do you want to draw about mushrooms or lichen, and then they can pick the thing that they want to investigate. But that might be different for you depending on who your students are and what your students' particular situations are. But when you're designing your lesson, you want to think about student autonomy like very early in the process. How are students going to have choice over what they're doing and what they're looking at? I think it's really important to set a schedule for kids and a time limit so that they know how long I should be doing this and how often I should be doing this. That gives them structure. And then you want to make sure that you are focusing their attention. There are a couple of ways to do this. It's really hard to be told, like, go out into your backyard and find something to draw, because a lot of their time is going to be spent on picking the perfect thing, right? So you can narrow their subject matter, like, I want you to draw a plant, or I want you to draw something new in the spring, or I want you to draw something, you can give them like a category of things. And you should also give them prompts. That prompt can be as simple as, I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of. It could also be, I want you to compare and contrast two similar organisms. It could be, I want you to record data about this set of behaviors of this animal that we're watching on a webcam. You want to have some sort of question or thing or purpose that they're investigating, so that they have some way to like really think about what they want to record and what is important to put in their journal. And then the last part is, it's really important to display student work and then to debrief and discuss the things that they found. I have found in my personal experience that students are often really proud of what they do, and giving them the opportunity to show their work and to talk about things that, what were you successful at? What surprised you? What was challenging for you, and how did you overcome that challenge? Those are really important things for them in terms of continuing to develop their skill, but also in talking about the subject matter. And so you should build something into your lesson design that uses their journal entries to a purpose. So either you're discussing the information that they found, or you're using their information to go on to other activities or further application. So what does this look like? And when we think about what this looks like, we really need to, again, think about issues of access and think about what is nature. Backyards are great. Gardens are great. Not everybody has a backyard. Boulevards are also great. The little patch of grass next to the road can be pretty surprising. I live in Minneapolis. I see birds of prey all the time. People are often surprised when I tell them that, but there is nature everywhere. I see rabbits all the time, all of those things. If kids can go to a local park and they feel safe there, that's a great option. But people can also use their own pets. I find that observing my dog is, always an adventure sometimes. Houseplants are great. Even looking out the window, I see birds out my window. There are all sorts of things that I can see without leaving my house. I'm also going to talk through a lesson idea around using a live webcam. There are lots of organizations that have webcams that live record animals that you can watch 24 hours a day. And even just using pictures that you take, or pictures that you find on the internet. There are all sorts of ways to make this accessible to students. And I'm sure you also have lots of great ideas for how to do that as well. But really thinking about redefining for students, what is nature, right? You don't have to be at Osprey Wild's Environmental Learning Center to experience nature. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples of units, but do we have questions? I saw some things popping up in the chat.
Yes, one of the things that I added to the chat was that Osprey Wilds has an Osprey cam, and I provided a link to that because we have an Osprey nest. And the other day we all got very excited because there was an Osprey using it. I'm sure he or she has been back lots of times, but I have only seen it that one time, and I have it up almost every day to watch.
We
So
actually,
the question that we have is, how might phenology or long-term observations be framed and presented? And what about stars and changing constellations and moon phases?
Oh, that is awesome. I never even thought about constellations, but I think that that's genius. Yeah, having kids make a star map of what they can see every day, and just tracking the stars across the sky, or even comparing with other students. This is what I can see, what did you see? Could be even really revelatory about social justice issues like light pollution, right? Wow, you saw a lot more stars than I did. Where do you live? Those can bring up really cool observations. And I really love, I think this is the perfect time to be doing phenology. Phenology, if you don't know, is the study of changes in nature, and particularly changes in the seasons. So you could do I'm looking out my window right now and I've got lilacs budding on my window. You could go to your lilac bush every day and draw what the buds look like and track them every day. And think about that. Or you could record what new bird species you're seeing every day, even if it's just a list and it's not a drawing, but that students have to observe 30 minutes a day out their window and write down every bird that they see, right? Those are ways to track phenology, and then collating your data with the other students, and then using that over a long period of time to kind of draw conclusions. Typically, for scientists, we do phenology yearly. So we're looking at differences across years, but you can also do it week to week and really talk about what is happening this week as opposed to last week, and what is going to happen next week. What predictions do you have? Things like that. I think that's a great suggestion. Other questions?
Claire also shares that the Minnesota weather calendar has records from the past, and that Josh says that Nature's Notebook is a good resource too.
Yeah, excellent. You guys are so smart. So what I have coming up next is a couple of ideas for different units that you could take and use for yourself, or tweak, or use as jumping off points. And I tried to come up with things for different age groups. And so thinking about if you work with students in middle grades. I remember when I was in 5th grade, I had to do a research paper on a butterfly, but I didn't get to pick my butterfly. I just remember I was assigned like a species of butterfly, and I did like do a natural history essentially. And so if we're thinking about like, how could you do an independent study with students by using nature journaling? So if your purpose is an end goal, a research paper on a Minnesota organism, right? So that's your purpose. That's step 1. What am I going to use this information for? Step 2 is then building in student autonomy. Can they choose an organism that lives in their backyard, right? Or that they can see out their window, or that they can visit at a local park, or that they can access a webcam about. But they pick their own organism, and then you set them a schedule and a time limit. You have to observe your organism every day for 15 minutes, right? And you have to talk about what you're noticing each day. And with your prompts, you might have your prompt be focused on what you want their body paragraph topics to be. So maybe one body paragraph is habitat. Maybe one body paragraph is adaptations. Maybe one body paragraph is where it is in the food web, right? So you could think through what you want the final product to be and base your prompts around that information. And not all of this information is going to be able to be gathered by nature journaling, but you're going to have students who have a jumping off point by making those observations that they can then support with further research. And then at the end, they can post their pages daily and then include them in their final papers, right? So as they're writing their little 5-paragraph essay, or however you want them to structure it, they can include images of their nature journal in that piece of work, which creates a much more cohesive kind of study. So that's just one idea going off of things that I know that students in this age group tend to do. It could be a jumping off point for you. I often find that when students do nature journaling, they get super into the thing that they're looking at and they want to find more information out about it. And so going onto the internet and having them do a little additional research to add to whatever they're doing can be a smaller and much shorter version of this as well. So I also thought about, okay, working with secondary students. I used to be a high school teacher. So thinking about secondary grades, I was thinking about cross-disciplinary skills, right? So thinking about a purpose of, I want to improve my students' observation skills. And I'm going to make them do that by having them create a field guide. And so they can choose a category of organism that they could observe, for instance, flowers, or herbaceous plants, or trees, or birds, or something that they have access to. They're going to observe a different organism each day. You'll notice that the time limit here is longer because these students are older and they're going to be doing a more in-depth entry, right? But for 30 to 40 minutes. And then they're going to have the same prompt every day. They're going to create an entry that is going to be like a field guide so that others could identify the organism that they are looking at. And then as a display, debrief, discuss, they can publish their field guide, and then other students can use that to attempt to ID organisms in their own neighborhood. And then when they find it, share a photo of it, right? It's like, oh, you drew this maple tree. I can find a maple tree, and I'm going to use the information in your field guide to go out and look for that. And then also thinking about if you really have kids who can't get outside, I was trying to think about, okay, so those two examples kind of necessitate being able to like go into a backyard to some extent, or going to a park to some extent. So if you really have students who can't do that, thinking about longitudinal data, how could you use a webcam to do effective nature journaling? So if your purpose is to collect wildlife data in order to draw conclusions as a class, right? You can have students choose a time of day that they're in charge of observing a webcam. There are lots of zoos and other organizations, Osprey Wild's included. We actually have 2 ospreys now at our nesting pole. They haven't built their nest yet, but they are around. But they get to pick a time of day that they're in charge of observing that webcam, with the understanding that nothing might happen during their section. And that's fine, that's all useful data. record observations of a live webcam for 20 minutes a day, right? Including some images and including observations of the animal's behavior or patterns. I like to include like a list of key behaviors to watch for. Like when we look at birds, we look for preening behavior or arousing or how they're standing or are they eating? When do they leave? When do they come back? Are they interacting with each other if there are multiple animals in the image? And then students can share their information and then use that information to draw conclusions about the animal's behavior, their adaptations, their niche in the ecosystem, all sorts of things, using the data that they observed as though they were field scientists. And there are lots of different layouts that you can use for those kinds of journal entries that are available online as well. So those were just a couple of jumping off points, things that I was thinking about that I might do with students if I were working with distance learning. But I'd also like to open up the chat. What other applications could you think of? Share some ideas for your colleagues in the chat, and maybe Erin can read out some of those for us, because I'm sure you guys have a lot of excellent ideas.
Rhonda says, I would like to use this for figurative language.
Oh, yeah.
I love the idea of using journaling to reinforce text features.
Mm-hmm.
I like the thought of the math applications for this. I know we have a school that goes outside. They have EE Wednesdays and they go outside. And then when it gets to be wintertime, like the days when it's too cold for them to be outside, they will use that and make graphs or gather all their data together, which I think is cool.
Yeah, numbers can play a huge part in your nature journal. Even just asking students to take measurements or to time things or to count. Or there are also like mapping activities that you can do, like, oh, you have an organism in your backyard, make a map of every time you see this same organism, right? And then you can kind of graph and things like that. It's really cool, especially if you're collating data with multiple students.
Another idea is to connect climate change and species change, comparing to past records. The, oh, Emily, what is that map? That big historic map of Minnesota where all of the
native,
yeah,
what the native vegetation would have
like
been.
the 1850s, right? You know what?
Yeah.
The Marshner map.
Yes.
I will put a link to it but it's an incredible resource for comparing what's here now and how much stuff has shifted north in the last even 30 years. It's really amazing.
Yeah, it was a map based on an 1800 surveyor prior to homesteading who went out and wanted to record what all the natural ecosystems were and went and surveyed. So it has all of the forest types and vegetation types of Minnesota listed. And it's super interesting because actually on that map, the prairie is much further east than it technically should be because of biomes and precipitation, because indigenous folks were extending the prairie through burns. They were managing the land and making the prairie larger. So there are lots of cool historical applications that you could use as well.
People have also said this connects well to how I teach reading and making connections to their texts. I also use it to identify birds and trees. I use it to review adjectives and nouns.
Oh, nice.
Using different purposes and prompts to explore different types of scientific study and careers. Choosing an object to measure the shadow at different times of day or week to week. Oh, great idea.
Oh, yeah. And then using math to figure out the circumference of the earth. No, I'm kidding. I mean, you could do that, but I don't know how to tell you how to do that. It is just about 9 o'clock. And so keep sharing your expertise because your colleagues can still see that in the chat. I'm going to share a couple of resources with you. And then if we have some final questions, we can spend some time to ask questions. But if you do need to get out at 9, I just want to make sure that we get this last information. So some questions that I always get asked. I'm not an artist. How do I get kids to engage with drawing in a meaningful way? And I have been talking about this throughout kind of the webinar, but I would just emphasize really focusing on that idea of growth mindset, and then also taking away a lot of the pressure to create something that is aesthetically beautiful and focusing more on the purpose of the information recording. And then building in scaffolding, allowing kids to trace or to draw from pictures, or things like that can really help kids feel more confident in their drawing. And then the second one, students always tell me they're done after 3 minutes. I'm sure that never happens to you guys. How can I get them to engage for longer? And I'm actually stealing this right from Emily Ligren, who is a nature journal instructor as well. She addresses the feeling of being done when she gives the prompt. So it's like, you might get to a spot where you feel like you're done. And when you feel like you're done, I want you to continue observing for 5 more minutes. And then when we debrief, we're going to talk about all the things you noticed after you felt like you were done. And so just labeling that feeling for students and recognizing that, like, sometimes when you feel like you're done, it means that you really don't know what else to do because you've never done this before, but encouraging students to kind of push through that feeling and continue to make observations, and then pointing out, hey, you made a lot of great observations after you felt like you were done, can be really helpful for folks. Make sure you're setting reasonable goals for yourself and your students. This is a hard time for everybody. Don't bite off more than you feel like you can chew. I can imagine getting 120 journal submissions and not having the time or the energy to grade all of those things. So make sure that you're setting really reasonable goals for what you can do. Consider front-loading activity, look at some models, and then remember to do your purposeful practice. And you may have to do it more than once, and then coming up with your meaningful application. And then some more resources. And these I really strongly recommend. This is what I base all of my nature journaling on. How to Teach Nature Journaling by Emily Ligren and John Muir Laws. This is a free PDF online. You just search it. You can go to Emily Ligren's website and download it. It's like 100% free. I would not recommend printing it because it is really a lot of pages. But it's a great resource. It has activities. It talks through how to do the activities and how to present them. They are based on like being able to go outside and like engage with your students, but her prompts are really great, and you can just use her prompts and use them in a distance application. The Beatles Project out of UC Berkeley has an online resource called Field Journaling with Students, which is another free PDF online. And that has a bunch of images of nature journals that you can use as models. And it kind of also goes over like, how do you learn how to do this? And how would you teach people how to do field journaling? And it also has different prompts and things in it as well. So those are some more resources for you if you really want to dive into doing this. And that's all I have. So if we have time for questions, we can take some questions.
Yeah, and I just wanted to remind folks that we are recording this and we'll post it later. So if you have to hop off, you can certainly come back and check the question section or want to refer back, and we'll share slides and we'll share notes and resources after that. You'll get them within the next day or two here. I also wanted to mention that I think a lot of our schools sometimes struggle with identifying evaluation metrics for their environmental literacy plans. And nature journals are an incredible way for you to measure a lot of different aspects of environmental literacy through something as simple as a presence and absence rubric. You know, you can compare from the amount of detail that students are gathering from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, or even over the course of a couple of months. And I think you're going to see incredible change. And that is actual data that you can gather and demonstrate to Audubon that you're increasing students' environmental literacy, even if it's framed as not a science project, because that's where people want to put environmental ed a lot, but you can frame it as ELA or social studies or math, and it can still be moving kids towards environmental literacy. So I just wanted to put in a plug for that. One question that we've gotten a couple places now, Emily, is about integrating these activities with younger students. How do you find success with that, especially with the real little ones like kinders and first graders?
For sure. Really, when you're thinking about working with much younger students, especially students who don't have a lot of capability to write on their own, especially, I really like to focus on things that they can do. Things like tracing, or even just making a drawing and circling things that they're noticing. If they can't write down their observations, they can at least emphasize it in their picture. You could also have them, I mean, this would help, you know, require an adult to help them, but they could record their observations like by speaking them out loud. Or you could have them do a drawing or have their object and almost do like a show and tell kind of thing where they bring their natural object to your video class and they share their observations about it with their peers. But yeah, it can be really challenging for students who aren't really at that age where they're writing consistently. But you can make it a space for them to practice those skills, like the things that they can write or the things that they can draw. I will admit that I have never really done this with kids younger than like 3rd grade, because that's not typically what we get up at the center. And so I'd be interested to see if other people had suggestions as well, in terms of how to incorporate this for students who are kind of still learning those skills of reading and writing.
Yeah, one of the comments that we just got here from Heidi up in Brainerd said, I've been asking students during this distance learning time to do sound maps weekly, beginning with 5 minutes and increasing by 5 minutes every week, and then sharing pictures of their entries. Do you want to talk a little bit? Are you familiar with that technology and what that might look like?
Sound maps?
Or, sorry, not that technology, that tool, yes, and how teachers might do that?
I'm actually not. I'm a little behind on tech integration because I work at a place with 0 tech. But I would really encourage using your technology creatively and encouraging students to interact in lots of different ways. It doesn't just have to be text, you know, it doesn't just have to be written, it could be spoken or delivered. I know there are a lot of different things where you can post short videos or even do like video blogs and things like that as well, but I think that that's a great idea.
Another question that we got was thinking, are there ways to, you talked a little bit about how this can help support mental health and physical well-being, but are there ways to more directly integrate social emotional learning, especially right now?
I think that really thinking about what your goals are, you want to think about that connection piece, that what does this remind you of piece? Because you can ask students to really focus on that or to go more in depth with thinking about what this reminds them of, and get them to write more about like, okay, so you brought up camping, tell me more about that, and really encouraging them to build in that space. It might also come up like if you have the time and the ability to do individual conferencing with your kids, which might not be your situation, but if you can do individual conferencing with kids, really diving into things that they've written about. You can give them different prompts, right? You can even ask them like, how did you feel when you looked at this organism? Or have them do reflection, right? So after doing your journal entry, how did you feel about that? Another part of social emotional learning is learning skills like self-regulation and persistence. And so part of your debrief might involve like, when you felt challenged, how did you respond to that challenge? So if you felt like you couldn't do a good drawing, did you give up? Or did you think about how you could improve? That's another aspect of social emotional learning that you can include in your debrief. And you can also encourage kids to have their own journal. Like whenever I do a journal, and I did this when I was a high school teacher and I had students who like kept a journal every day. I always told them that if there was a part of their journal they didn't want me to look at, to mark it, so that, and then I would skip that page when I was grading their journal, so that they know that their journal is a space for them to express things that they don't necessarily want me to see. And that is totally fine. And if you make that explicit to them, then you'd be surprised how many of them actually take that opportunity to actually use this notebook that has become very familiar to them to like express things in, and use that as a more therapeutic journaling as well. So really, in terms of social emotional learning, you can really think about some great prompts that you can have kids work with, and also build space for them to write things that you don't look at.
We have another, Mara from Cross Lake shared that we've been contributing to a shared Google Slides presentation.
Mhm.
So far, we've been taking photographs that show phonology, but we could also snap a picture of a journal page and share that way during distance learning.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I love building shared Google Slides because kids just send you a picture and then you can present it. It's super easy.
And then someone else shared, we just finished reading The End of the Wild by Nicole Helget, which is
Mhm.
intended for 4th through 8th grade readers. It would be a great tie-in for nature journaling, especially making a field guide.
Mhm. These are great examples of tie-ins.
All right, well, I think we want to be respectful of everybody's time, and we know that you've got kids that you need to go attend to today. So I'll hand it back over to you, Emily, to wrap it all up.
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody for being here. It was really exciting to see some of your names. So thanks for coming and attending the webinar. Obviously, you can get my email off of the Osprey Wilds website, but my email is just my last name, porter@ospreywilds.org, if you ever want to ask me any questions about applications that you have in mind. And I would really recommend that you check out these resources that I have up on the screen because they're free and they're excellent, and they will really help guide you in terms of implementing this in your class. So thanks for being here. Best of luck to all of you, and thank you for your really hard work during this difficult time. Being a classroom teacher was already probably the hardest job in the world, and I really admire all of you for continuing to put your best effort into making this a meaningful experience for kids as we close out the school year. So thanks for being here.
And thank you so much, Emily, for sharing your knowledge and wisdom and experience with us. This was incredibly helpful. Even for those of us who are regular nature journalers, I learned something too. So this was awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks everybody.